Zerbashkin. Good evening, everyone. Just some housekeeping to start off. Tom McGuire, the Associate Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at UChicago, will provide instructions about the Q&A procedure later on in the talk. So I would just advise everyone to please pay attention to the group chat so that we could be able to have everyone's question answered. So today's talk is entitled The Ferman of 1915, a personal account from Bepressione. Professor Charles Haberl will be delivering this talk, as Professor Bashkin indicated. Professor Haberl is an associate professor at the Department of African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Languages and Literatures at Rutgers University. He was born and raised in New Jersey and received his PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from Harvard University. In addition to teaching Arabic and Aramaic, Professor Haberl also teaches courses on folklore and minorities in the Middle East. Professor Haberl is perhaps most well known for his extensive work on the Mandaean language. His monograph, The Neo-Mandaic Dialect of Khorramshahr, is the first account of a previously undocumented dialect of Neo-Mandaic and the most thorough description of any Neo-Mandaic dialect. Without further ado, please welcome to the University of Chicago, Professor Charles Haberl.
Thank you, Joseph and Orait, for that really fulsome introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here. It gives me an excellent segue into what I'm about to discuss. I'd first, of course, like to start by thanking the Assyrian Universal Alliance Foundation and all of our other donors for making this series, this very important series on a very important topic, possible. And I also feel obliged to mention that the research that I'll be discussing tonight is also funded by a generous grant from the Russian Science Foundation. Now, what I'm about to discuss is a matter of history, and this is a bit strange because, as Joseph mentioned and Orait mentioned, I'm actually a linguist, and I don't necessarily identify as a historian, but as a linguist, I do deal with texts of a historical nature, and so one such text will be the primary subject of what I'll be discussing today. As I mentioned, I'm a linguist. I don't necessarily work exclusively with languages and books. I also put myself in the somewhat infantilizing position of becoming an adult language learner of a language that's spoken exclusively by people who have learned it from childhood. And very often they're not in a position to understand who these weird adults are who have come to them to learn a language that they only really know to teach a child how to teach. And so this is our personal struggle as field linguists, and some of you are probably familiar with this struggle. The subject of my research today is the language known as Sureit or Turoyo. Linguists in the West often refer to it as Turoyo, which is indeed one of its names, although it seems to be a name that people apply to it from the outside. And all these names refer to a specific contemporary form of the Aramaic language that is today spoken in Tur Abdin, a region of Turkey, in what is today the modern Turkish Republic, and in a large diaspora in places like Sweden, the Netherlands, and also in my home state of New Jersey. The interesting thing about this language and what drew me to study it in Tur Abdin is the fact that it's still spoken there in its original ecological setting, so to speak, in its homeland. Unlike so many other forms of Aramaic, which are spoken almost exclusively in a diaspora because the ancestors of the people who speak it have been ethnically cleansed from their home territories. They've been forced to migrate out of their homelands, and they found refuge in a variety of different countries. What distinguishes Turoyo or Sureit or Turoyo from these other languages is that one can actually go back to the villages where they've lived for thousands of years and interview people who are using this language in their own native setting. And that makes a huge difference, particularly when you're studying the culture, the material culture of the people and their lived experiences in these regions. So I would like to share with you a PowerPoint presentation, and I'll do that right now. And let's make sure I've got the audio going. In which I'll explain the project and I'll show some of our workflow. That's how I'll begin here. So here we are. These are three of the linguists who are involved in this project. Up here on the right-hand side is Ilyas Iranla, who is he's from Kfarze in Turabdin, and he's our primary Turoyo collaborator. He's an educated man. He's almost exactly my age, having been born in the same month, the same year that I was. And here on my left is Gule Demir, who is our Kurmanji collaborator, our specialist. And these two provide us with necessary background linguistic expertise and competencies on the languages that are the subject of our research here in Turabdin. So when we go out into the field, I mean, many of you may think of the field as being this place, perhaps wearing a pith helmet and in the jungle or something like that. But more often than not, it's a social setting where we're hosted by these very generous people. On the left-hand side here is one of our informants. Her name is Shmuni, and she lives in Bekosiane, which is the subject of today's talk. In the middle here, between the two of us, is Sergei Lyosov, who is the principal investigator of the grants that fund our research, and I'm here on the far right. And this shows you something of how we engage and how we record and collect the data that we do in the field. And then finally, after having been out in the field, we return back to our base in Midyat. And as you can see, it can be quite frenetic. We're trying to crunch and interpret all the data that we've received. And as anyone who's done field linguistics will tell you, in fact, you collect many, many, many hours of things, and it takes you years to transcribe and interpret everything that you've collected. Now I'd like to tell you a bit about our language expert. This is Nisane Ergun. So I introduced her with the term language expert. In the past, we would refer to such individuals as informants, but unfortunately, this term has somewhat unfortunate connotations, particularly given the sensitive nature of our location, the research, and its topic. So I prefer in this instance to refer to her as a language expert, and indeed she is, even though, unlike many other experts whom you may assume, she has no formal education whatsoever. She's never set foot inside of a school. She was born in 1933, which is, of course, some years after the event she's about to describe. But she's speaking on the authority of her husband, her father-in-law, her mother, and her grandmother as well. And I will allow her in a second to speak in her own words. As I mentioned, she is a woman, and this is a very important aspect of her identity in the sense that women very often make the best cultural experts on language. It's very often in the home from your mother that you learn to speak a language. And although in the past, many of us, because traditionally those field linguists have been men, the field is unfortunately very male dominated. And as a consequence, particularly when working in predominantly Muslim societies, our informants tend to be men as well. We've specifically selected a number of women who have turned out to be excellent raconteurs, excellent storytellers, and have an amazing command of this language with a rich vocabulary. And I think this has made a huge difference in the quality and the content of the data that we've collected, linguistic data. So she was born in Bekosiane.
What are you streaming?
Which is today Turkish Alagöz. But currently she resides in Derkube, and I think I'll be showing you just now where these locations are to give you a kind of a sense of where she's coming from and where she lives. So this is a map of Turabdin, and the larger map in the inset shows you exactly where it is in regards to these other countries. You can see that Turabdin is a somewhat hilly, mountainous region just north of the Syrian panhandle, the Jazeera, in the southeastern corner
Where are
of
you
Turkey.
streaming it from?
And if I can zoom in here a little bit, this is Google Maps.
It?
If you follow me, you can see Bekosiane, which is her birthplace in the center of this talk. It's here in an inset surrounded by some hills. And she now lives directly to the east in Derkube, right? And to give you a better context of where this is all taking place, some of you may be familiar with Midyat. That is right over here. So Midyat is in the center. It's located closer to the center of Mardin province in southern Turkey. And these are located further to the east. And you can see the border between Shırnak and Mardin right here. So I'll return now to my presentation. If you haven't had the opportunity to visit this, the landscape of this region, it's quite impressive. Most of the buildings are constructed in this type of, in the local stones. This is kind of a boxy architecture. What I'm showing here is the Church of Morelio. It's the primary church in Becosione. And this is the sign leading into it. You may notice that recently, in the last 10 years or so, the signs have gone up, the street signs have gone up with the names in the various languages of the region. So here we have the Syriac, the Assyrian script down in the bottom, and then the Latin script that's favored by the Turkish Republic on the top. But this is a new development. In the past, this would have been referred to as Alagöz and exclusively as Alagöz. Now, Derkube, where she currently lives, is a much smaller village far to the east. I've also had the opportunity to visit it. And the picture that I'm using here to demonstrate, it's actually taken from Wikipedia. This is the Church of Moryakob, for whom the town Derkube is named. And it features very heavily in the story that she's about to tell you. So I wanted to draw your attention to that fact. So, as I mentioned before, she was born in 1933. She has absolutely no formal education whatsoever. She is completely illiterate, but she does, however, speak 2 languages fluently, which is more than a lot of Americans could say, for example. She speaks Turoyo, which is her native language, and she also speaks Kurmanji fluently, and she operates in both languages, sometimes even at the same time. In many of the stories that we've collected from her, she will sing verses in Kurmanji, and then she'll narrate the story around the verses in Turoyo. She slips seamlessly between these 2 languages. She also is the matriarch of an enormous family. She has 14 children, of which 11 survive, 6 boys and 5 girls, some of whom live with her, and some of whom continue to live in Turkey, and others who have gone into the diaspora of people from Tur Abdin, about which I'll talk later. So this is her, and I'm about to share with you, and hopefully this will work, the video in which she recounts her parents and her in-laws' story about the 1915 Furman, or Ufurman is the word they have for the genocide of 1915. Very often this is also known as the Saifo, the sword, particularly in the Assyrian diaspora, and among Arab Christians who incidentally were not spared the fate of their Armenian and Syrian co-religionists. It's known as the Kafle, or convoy. However, unlike these Armenians, the Greeks, and the Assyrians of territories further east, the Christians of Tur Abdin successfully resisted removal and extermination, which makes her story a kind of interesting, almost an alternate history, right? What would have happened if these people were not exterminated, if they were not ethnically cleansed from the region? What would their lives be like today if they remained within the territory, in their historic territory? And I think actually as a kind of control group, the people of Tur Abdin have a lot to share with us about this. So while, as I mentioned, Nisane was not born yet at the time of the Furman, or the Saifo, she relates here the story of her family's miraculous survival on the authority of her father's mother. So I'm going to full screen this.
منكي بندغينا على الإمخ وبابخ يعني من الدحزلخ مني أي دربويني هيكو ويني
مالك عمري حمش شناي أيمي مايثو اللي قشتي محكوة بوفرمان حتى للبابي بيرحلته مايثو مي وزاتيه مي بيخدتيه مي رزيليه مايثو بوفرمان وزلام تقشتي اقطي وقشتي كتوي لا تريح ونوني الذهن حام بالي لسفر بالك لضاعر وحاكته اللي كركو علو عربولو ما كمل أروح يسي خد دايريتو ما كمل أروح أخد دايريتو فايشو إنا قد إيمي إيدي كتلا ترتيكا تقتيلو زلاميدا زال مديا شو دنوا ميقم بالكي كذع توخا كيتونو عزيوا دولابو هوخا قرسيوا ودو بنو نهاقد لحم خليوا كتشكي مديدة بليدة دستماعيتو فايشو إيمي ما قدر لي هوخا داثن أقسنوي لقريتو ناقصنوي لقريتو أتو لقريتو
أي ما قصني هاي كويني
سنتاي هنا قدو فرمان
أبو فرمان تاي هي
تاي هي الذهن فايشي بقسيون خليتو أبو فرمان أمي قاموا فرمان حميوني وواحن الصليبة سيغيو أين قاعدو لا تاخدو عدو يقولوا دي تقيت بلا قمتو مثحو يمقبر عيليتو وتهلو عدو عفرمينا كوسيغيلا باعولي بدرهت ايه آفي اللومدور قبل حاجياغا آغاد بحاجي خورتك ويوا هكي قاليو بمرانكي تارس لي بطري ومرتخ أزديو مردانكو صليبا مكوسي متوبية ضد خالص علي ستايدي راويخو مكوسي أميارو كوسي كمي فرمانيو كوسي غنى يقورد عصينا إيبا ومردي كزيقا بومدور هلدوثينو أزيقا مدور أفندي دريل الشلوم وهم خيرات الفلان ومندور أفندي مكبعات خير يوم تارس لغ بثري ومار كتلوغ 3 قرياوثي سلوروي حامني رومش مفاشان وريساس ما حد نبغضوه ومارون سعلافك مشايان كمان بيما خلصينا مني بحيلة شرعي من نافخ ومار كمان مخ هينو كما فخل مكتوب قريلي ومار حامني رومش مفاشان وريساس ما حد نبغضوه هيدي كناف قبو مدور ميابي لحدك كاربوران فروط ويني ولا اللي خبرو ومر لازم يو لا بتخوات ساغ أنسى حرافي ومر لازم يو بخيرات يعني ومر لازم يو أوتو لي مرانكي ملا دي لحدك كاربوران وآتي ملا إيلان ستيني الحميوني والواحنو ومر لازم نحاتوا لي مرانكي وفي المناطق ميدا ولا قام لا يدي محامينا نحاتوا لي مرانكي أنه شيدا نطلع عصرب وتهكي ناحيتي لي مرانكي بيلا حدك استيقاثن كتو إلي حدا حصار ابني تارس لي أنا ابني وأبرازي وأنا أنا حنوني أعمى محتي لي بقصة حاح محتي لي بقصة حاح أزالي نقبت بقسيوني زغل بقسيوني ينقبت عولكو بالقطاعنا ومبراو قسنوي قاموا في المناطق ميدا ولا لا يدي محامينا قوموا الحاح ناقص نو يسمط عني الذهن الحاك 200 دهارو لو دلوك 200 دهارو أينال كلايو بوديارات قمحاح دب قسيوني أنا كومحكن يعني كومحكلن لوح زي لنا إحنا كومحكلن ميقع مرة الموردو قصرو هكا حوت لان ما رشفاعوا العواردو وهكا لك حوت لان ما رفتحوا تعودو قصرو ساليقي قسنوي شفاعوا العبارة دار بوليد بقصو افتحوا ترعود قصو شاني جويد لوثني قاموا يتشيكي بقصر حارو فايشي 6 نهارو أثيكم مصافرة زاز أثيو لحد تقولوا كمينا كت قريتو هوخا حرب بين البيقسيون الحاح فرعطو رومانك آثن التامو كتاقوبو تامو ماشغي ذو فوثاش تالي حرق على قصنو أزن الحاح حالك كنت فنقات مني احنا استير رزان ايضا الشعب بيحقو اسمد بمسعد مولد بيلعقو قويد بمقسي الرزانة تويني بتفنقة تويني ما تعرى علي حاجة ما صبابنو ما لي حانون وقانون كالب بقسيوني زخلو مال ديارو لو قطلو تقسنوي ادي شريدي لو مال ديارو قعيجدي وقنيوني والحيفة والصفر ومال ديارو ناحية البقسيون قسنوي لقطي كل تشيكي بو قصرو فايشي 40 يوم يبو قصرو أنا قحشة أقول لكم حرايخو توالت لاتوا وبيدرتوا وحيموا وقيطوا وموه المقوم دحدودي وموه ليحو ناف ليش بناثي حموتي متخيتي نفشوت بحال مقولة بيدرتوا دو قصرو إيه عندي كمال وفدي الذهن نافيقي آثي الشيخ فتح الله بمعنتاب وآتي بتشالبيني وإيه حكومة آتيو لا على البغدي حكومة لا تيو الشيخ ويفتحوا ترعدو قصرو تفتحوا ترعدو قصرو ميدي لا تدوس بزي على طاي يسهان قريعي لا طاي روعي وباقوري وداوري أصن دي سابينا طاي أصن بينا طاي بكمشنا يهد آتني دي لقريد.
All right. So I hope everyone was able to see the subtitles there. Let's see here. What I'd like to do now for you is to try and unpack some of what was going on in that video. She spoke very quickly, I know. It's a story that she tells that may be familiar to many of you. It's a story of how the people of Beklosione were spared from genocide by a local Aha, whose name was Hajo Aha. And I'd first begin to I'd like to start by demonstrating to you, showing to you some of the locations in which the story unfolds. So she mentioned first that her husband's family was here in Der Kulbe. That's where she now lives. And the local Ara, who is based here in Meranke, right? This is down further to the south, right here. It's today called Bashur. And in Kurdish is known as Meranke, was traveling to visit the people in the area that he controlled, which included at that time 3 villages of Assyrians, Der Kulbe, Beklosione, and Hah. He happened to be visiting the in-laws in Der Kulbe when he came upon them fortifying their church, that boxy structure that I showed you before. I'll show it to you again. And he said, I'm now on my way to Midyat, which is further here to the west, to meet with the local Kaimakam, whom Nisane refers to as the Mudur. And he said, wait for me, don't do anything until I've gone to speak, I've gone to Midyat, and I've met with this person, and then we'll pick it up from there. So, and just to mention, the third village is Ha, that's down here. I'll return to this later. So, this is the structure that they were fortifying. Now you can see it has some of the basic characteristics of a fort, right? What they're doing is they're putting brambles on the top here, and they're going to station themselves with guns for when the marauders came. She also mentions in her talk that it was actually much lower to the ground than it was before. The cemetery, which was behind this, was much higher. So they could actually walk up into this, and it was almost like a cliff facing the village. They could walk up to the top here along the soil. It's been since removed, right? So now the entire structure is exposed, but before it was quite easy to get to the top. Now I mentioned before this individual, Hajoha, and she speaks quite highly of him, which may come as a surprise to those of you who are familiar with the story, because in some of the accounts, including David Gaunt's, he's pictured as something of a villain. Now, as she mentioned before, he was the head of the Hajohortek clan of the Havarki Confederation, right? And he was based in Meranke. Now, Hajoha is considerably more famous for his career after the war than during the war. Most people don't know much about him before then. But in the aftermath of the Sheikh Said rebellion in 1925, he led the Kurds of the region of his confederation in an uprising against the Turkish government, as a consequence of which he was forced to flee to Syria in 1926, where he spent the rest of his life. And there he became one of the founders of the Khoibun organization, which was founded in October of 1927 in Hamdun in Lebanon. He later became involved in the efforts of the Christian refugees, the Assyrian refugees in the Syrian Jazeera, to secure autonomy, right? At the end of the French Mandate, various portions of Syria were planning to break off, and the Jazeera was one of them. He chaired a general conference of the Jazeera seeking full self-government for the Christians and Kurds of that region. So when I read about his subsequent career after the war, after the genocide, it doesn't ring true to me that this man was a villain. It sounds to me like what Nisane says about him has more of a ring of truth. Now, also, there is, however, one aspect of his story that is somewhat flawed in Nisane's tale. During the Firman, during the Seifo, the Turks actually imprisoned him at Harput in Elazığ, presumably after he informed the people of Derkobe and Karbaran to flee to Hah, right? And they compelled his son, Hassan Hajot, to participate in the Firman, which means that he couldn't have been there in Hah at the time that she said he was. However, it does seem as if the Kaymakam of the region, the Turkish Kaymakam, did make good upon his threat, and he was sent to prison along with a lot of other local Kurdish leaders who are not on board with the genocide. So I mentioned before the Mudur, or the Kaymakam. In fact, this is a known historical personage. His name is Haji Bashar Bey, and he was serving provisionally as the Kaymakam in Midyat. And what his role was as the architect of this plan to exterminate the Christians of Turabdin, what his role was is to gather all the Kurdish and Arab tribal chiefs of the region to seek their support for their attack on the Christians. Now, this is a known event, right? This happened on July 2nd of 1915. So again, what Nisane has to say about this, even though she's speaking on the authority of her father's mother, has the ring of truth. And I will also note that as when you heard her speak, she's very clear about the limits of her own knowledge. She says, when you hear about these things, they tell us about them, but we haven't seen them. There's this tree called the fig tree of Harrow. I've never seen it. I don't know where it is, that sort of thing, which makes her, in my opinion, a very reliable narrator. So I don't actually have a picture of this gentleman, the architect of this plan to exterminate the Christians of Turabdin. Instead, what I have here for you is the picture of the backside of a Turkish general soldier at the rank of Kaymakam, who's kind of like a lieutenant general. And that will have to do for us in his absence. Now, the Christians, the villagers of Bekosyan and Derkobe, they all fled to Hah. Now, I don't need to show you where it is again. At the time, and to this day, the villagers are primarily Christians, but they all speak Kurmanji. That was the case during the time of the genocide, and that is the case even to this today. That being said, the current Mukhtar, whose name is Habib Doan, is actually working very hard to revive Turoyo there. He speaks it, and other members of his of the community in what is today in Turkish called Anitla also speak, are learning to speak Turoyo. It's not indigenously spoken there. They speak Kurmanji to this day, but they're also learning the language in an attempt to revive it in Turabdin. Now, the castle mentioned in Nisane's narrative is actually the old cathedral of Hah. Hah has a bit of a storied history as being the site of the first bishopric, the first diocese in Turabdin. It was one of the first cities to be Christianized in the region. But this structure here, of which I have a picture, is known today by the local villagers as Ukusro de Mariuhanan, or the Mariuhanan, St. John's Castle. And this is where the villagers from Bekosione and the villagers of Hah itself kind of hold themselves up in order to defend themselves. As the Kosnoye were trying to get into this castle, where the people of Hah had already entered, a mob, or what she describes as Ikalmo, was busy cleansing Zaz. That was her words, not mine. She described it as a cleansing. Now, according to Gaunt, the perpetrators of this cleansing, the ethnic cleansing of Zaz, were the clans of Shtarako, which is led by certain Latif, and the clans of Hito and Haydoro, as well as the Derhav tribe, which is led by Osman Sile. These were presumably this Kaumo or mob, which then proceeded to the ruins of Gauro. Now, I include this picture because it also gives you a very good impression of the architecture of Turabdin. Because of the fraught history of this region and the villages, each and every home is like a little fortress, you can see. The mob from Zaz then decamped at what Nisani describes as the ruins of Gauro, which was formerly a village on top of one of the hills between Bekosione and Hah. Now, what you see here are the only such ruins visible from Google Maps, and which may or may not be the place in question. Bekosione is located here off to the right, and then Hah is just due south of these ruins. So I presume that this is the location. I haven't been there in person to verify what this is the case or not. But this is where the mob from Zaz decamped and where they took water and they began their preparations to attack Ha. Okay, so I've talked a bit about the bad folks, the villains of this story. I think I also need to discuss some of the good folks. So one of the first persons that she mentions is this fellow who is Sheikh Fethullah Hamidi, who was born in 1873 in Ain Kaf, which is where she mentions him being from. And he died after the Second World War in April of 1947. Now, some of my local cultural experts claim that he came from a Muhalami family, which is to say that his ancestors were Syriac Orthodox Christians who converted to Islam. But other sources claim that his family migrated from further south in Arabia, so his recognition as a Muhalami may be retrospective. Whatever the case may be, he was a very important sheikh for the Kurds of this region. He issued a fatwa against the ethnic cleansing of Christians already in 1914, right? He saw this coming and he said, this is anathema. You should not participate in this. And he became famous the following year in 1915 for negotiating armistices between the local Armenian and Assyrian Christians, most notably at Ewardo, Darod Slivo, Ha, and Kfar Gauze. The third peacemaker, whom Nisane mentions for us, is Ismail Chelebi Agha, who is spotted here in this picture from Gertrude Bell's Amurath to Amurath. And he was the Agha of Mazizah, which is to the southwest of Ha, past Kfarze, where Ilyas comes from, and Ewardo. Today, his descendants reside in Astel, which is the Muhalami quarter of what is today the modern city of Midyat. And he was kinsman to Hajo Agha of Meranke, and their ancestors came from that same region, which is known in Kurdish as Zahoran. Famously, when Gertrude Bell was robbed in Ha prior to the war, and you can read about this in her book, Ismail Chelvi Agha was summoned from Mazizah to adjudicate this dispute, which is why his image appears in her book. And this is the only picture we have of him. He had previously protected the local Christians during the Hamidian massacres at the end of the 19th century. And perhaps for this reason, the Ottoman authorities imprisoned him right away. They sent him to Harput, just like they sent Hajo Agha to Harput during the Firman. And that left his nephew, Sarukhano, in charge of the Chelebi. But unlike Hassan Hajo, his nephew also refused to participate in the slaughter of local Christians, and Ismail Chelebi was eventually released after the Firman, at which he returned along with Hajo Agha and the rest to negotiate the return of the people of Bekosione. Okay, I'd like to conclude my narrative where I began, which is with our cultural expert, and here she is again. So she remained there, obviously. She was born and raised after the genocide in Bekosione, and she went from there to Derkobe. And it is this experience of her rich life that makes her such a consummate storyteller. And I think you get a glimpse of this in the video. You can see how animated she is. You can sense, I'm sure, even if you don't speak Surait, you can get a sense of her command of the language and her fluency and her capacity in telling stories. And also, because of this life's worth of experiences in situ, in her original homeland, makes her one of the best remaining speakers of this language. Unfortunately, most, if not all, the speakers, including Shmuni, whom I showed you a picture of earlier, were born in the interwar period, right, between the two wars, between the First World War and the Second World War. And when they pass, as they inevitably must do, and I wish her many long years, they will take with them untold riches in the form of their history, their culture, and the language of the Suryani people, which is why it is essential that we document their stories today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Haberl. And I just wanted to sort of start off with a quick question. Could you tell us a little bit more about your work in Tarabdin? What sort of project are you working on speaking to these informants?
All right. Specifically, the topic of the project is to document the village dialects of Turoyo. Now, those of you who have studied Turoyo or know anything about it know that the experts to whom we owe our best acquaintance with the language in the West, who is Helmut Ritter and Otto Jastro, worked exclusively with members of the diaspora. And the dialects that they documented were primarily they work with Midin, the dialect of Midin. Ritter worked in Istanbul and Yastro worked in Germany, if I'm not mistaken. There haven't actually been a lot of scholars who've gone. I mean, I'm speaking, of course, of German and American and all these other scholars. I'm not talking about indigenous scholars who need to be mentioned. A lot of the scholars, those linguists such as myself, have not actually done field work in Tur Abdin, which is why I felt it was very important for me to go and do this as well. My previous work in language documentation has been almost exclusively with members of the diaspora. And this is, of course, very typical of people who work on Aramaic, because the Aramaean, the Assyrian diaspora is just so vast, right? I mean, they're all throughout the Western world. They're much more accessible than many of the regions in which they lived before, if you could even find them there. So we are documenting the village dialects, such as that of Beklosione, such as that of Derkobe, Kfarze, where Ilias is from, all of these villages that haven't been documented before. And I must say that they're similar in many respects to that which has been previously documented, but they also differ in other interesting aspects, and even from speaker to speaker. So what we're doing is, in addition to expanding our knowledge of the language, Surayt or Turoyo, we're also collecting, I think, priceless cultural artifacts, these texts, that include, for example, this anecdote from her own history. We've collected texts about material culture. We've collected folk tales, and I think we're going to expand the corpus of texts in Turoyo manyfold, right? We'll suddenly be able to benefit from a massive corpus of texts that will undoubtedly enrich our understanding of Aramaic for generations to come. At least that's my hope.
Okay, so
Absolutely.
let me just say how the discussion will go. So first, you can see at the chat that, you're going to print your questions here, and then Joe will summarize them, or you can use the raise your hand function. As I've mentioned before, the series is made possible through the generous donation from the Assyrian Universal Alliance Foundation. And you can see also in the chat box the names of our donors, Dr. Michael, Dr. Ishaya, and so forth. So you can sort of look at the chat for the questions and for the people who make this talk possible. And I will let Joseph continue from here. Joe, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. So we do have a question in the chat, and I'll get to it here in just a moment. But again, yeah, for those who don't know how to raise their hand on Zoom, it's actually in the participants part there at the bottom. So you can go ahead and do that, and then once we select, you can unmute and ask your question. But we do have one question from Shamiran Mekko, who's asking, obviously you're dealing with people dealing with very serious trauma, and the things that they may describe and tell could put them, in a vulnerable position due to the sensitive nature of the issues that they may be covering. So she's asking, was an IRB obtained for this research given human subjects were used?
That's an excellent and I think a very astute question. As I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, this project is funded by a grant from the Russian Sciences Foundation. The principal investigator and many of my colleagues actually work at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. This is not an American funded project. It's actually funded in Russia. I've sought funding for documentation of language documentation for Aramaic from a variety of sources in the United States. It's been a total failure thus far. That being said, and of course the requirements for IRB, which I say are as much moral as administrative, differ from country to country. So since this is not an American funded or organized project, we don't use American standards for IRB. That being said, I do believe very strongly in informed consent. I'm sure to collect it from all of my informants. In the case of an informant such as Nisane, and this presents an interesting question, as she is illiterate, I can't actually show her documentation or get her to sign documentation, in which case the consent to be given must necessarily be oral. But other members of our other members who have participated in this are, of course, educated individuals, and they have kind of signed on to this project on their own. I hope that answers your question. It's a difficult question to answer. It's a very important one as well.
Thank you. And again, just to reiterate, I mean, you can raise your hand using the participants tab, or you can post your question in the chat. Yeah, I'm not sure if we may be a little bit light on questions. Yeah, so again, okay, so I think Shamira Mekko raised her hand here. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute her. She was the one who asked the question about the IRB.
Thank you so much, Joseph, and thank you so much, Dr. Haberl. This is really fascinating. I've been to Turaddin, and it's such an intricate place, and it's definitely a space for a lot of potential research on this and in many forms on the Assyrian community there. On the question of IRB, the reason why I ask is because I've recently reviewed a few papers for academic journals where this question of IRB, especially of actually people who don't speak Western languages and people who are illiterate. And some of this work has been done on like Yazidi victims of genocide who are also illiterate. And so the question of IRB and permission is becoming increasingly important. And it offers, you know, protection for the researcher, but also for the nature of the research. And it's not necessarily, IRB is not just US based. Many institutions across the world have it. It may be different, but it's nevertheless, you know, it's a mechanism that's there and that's used. And that was the context behind my question. Thank you.
Right, absolutely. I don't mean to, as I suggested, it does differ from country to country. I never meant to imply that that researchers, regardless of where they are based, should not follow it. I think it's very important that we have a frank and earnest conversation about with our cultural experts about exactly the topic of the data that we're collecting from them, how we intend to use it, and so where it will be published, if it's going to be published at all, where it will be archived, and to make sure that we have their permission to use it. I'm very, very, particularly when you're dealing with such a sensitive political topic as this. So I'm 100% in agreement with you. I think that's very important.
And we have a question here from Robert Hoberman. Can you tell about your experiences doing the field work, finding speakers and explaining to them what you're doing, host, living, travel, and so on?
Right. Well, it's a bit like social networking. What happens is when you meet someone, I mean, those of you who have had the privilege of getting to know the Assyrians, realize that community is such a very important part and of their lives. And once you know someone, and in such a small world as Turaddin, you kind of know everyone, or certainly they know about you. And so between finding one informant, which can lead to another, or one cultural expert, which can lead to another linguistic expert, and so on and so forth, we have people who volunteer. When we meet with them, it is even at our own imperfect level of understanding of the language. I'm not a native speaker. I'm not even a fluent speaker by any means. I do the best I can. It becomes incredibly clear which people have the gift of gab and who are fluent and capable speakers of their language, and those who are perhaps not as gifted as experts. And that factors heavily into the decisions that we make when we decide to proceed with collecting data from these individuals.
Thank you. And we have sort of a flurry of questions coming in now. So I'm going to go to one of the hands coming, one of the hands that are raised, and then I'll go back to the chat here. So I'll go with Belmina first here. Go ahead.
Hi, I appreciate the lecture. This was really informative, and I thank you for doing it. Just a question right now with regards to the location that you were talking about. Just are there any Assyrians still there, and or like anywhere in the surrounding area? And just wondering, like, what happened to the churches? Were they destroyed? Is there anything left over at this time? Thank you.
All right, most of the villages that we visited that I discussed in this lecture are today Christian. The churches are operational. You can visit them. In places like Darkobe, they're so small that they don't have a priest who's there all the time. But during the holidays, a priest will come from Beklosione or further afield to officiate. And some of the texts that we have collected do indeed deal with the various feasts and holidays that are practiced by the people who are living there and how they perform their religion in their daily life.
Okay, and then back to the chat here. We have someone asking about like young people. Are they living in these villages? Are they becoming part of the larger Assyrian diaspora? And for those who are, remaining in the villages, what is the sort of relationship with the Turkish government there?
That's an excellent question. I think the lure of Istanbul is such that everyone of a certain generation, let's say my age or younger, very often does end up leaving, or they end up going to the diaspora. As I mentioned, many of the people in the villages to whom I spoke and the people with whom we worked had family in the diaspora, primarily in this case in Belgium. That's where many of Nisane's relatives ended up. A large number of them have gone to my home state of New Jersey. New Jersey looms large in the imagination of the people of Tor Abdin as the location for immigration. Which may be strange for many of you who live in the US, who probably think of my state as the armpit of America, but it's not that to them. They view it as a much more attractive and enticing place. I would say that the relationship with the Turkish government, and this is something to which I would actually point you to some of the articles that we've published that have appeared in the Journal of Semitic Studies or will appear in the Journal of Semitic Studies. It's a complicated one, right? Because in all of their complexities of life there, the Turkish government has governed this area with a very heavy hand. I'm not even going into the genocide. I'm talking about the post-life. Now, had I continued with Nisane's life, I would talk about the famine of the 40s, which she experienced firsthand. I would talk about the Kurdish insurgencies in the 90s that continued into the 2000s. And it's been tough. And at one point, she was actually moved. I mean, this is shades of the genocide again. They said, get out of Darkobe. We're sending you to Beklosione. We want to kind of cleanse out this area to make it easier for us to fight against the PKK. And, of course, this terrified everyone. The people in Beklosione weren't happy to have people moved into their town either. So on the other hand, at times, and this may seem counterintuitive, our informants speak quite positively about the Turkish government. And I think, as I said, the relationship with it's extremely complicated.
Professor Sargondanabit.
Thank you, Charles, for the very informative talk. I just had a couple of questions. Just briefly, when you're talking about collecting the information from the villagers as being a focal point, especially since the issue of diaspora, influence in the diaspora and changing of dialects once people move to the diaspora, that the focus of your work or the work that's being done there being so vital is that, still these people living in these villages speaking their particular dialects. How do you deal with the issue of returnees? So for instance, since the early 2000s and rebuilding of probably Kafro Tahteto as probably the first village that was really rebuilt by European Assyrians who had gone, or Assyrians from that village who had moved to Europe and then gone back and rebuilt their village. As we know, in diaspora settings, these dialects start to mingle together. And so, for instance, the region of around Ahwo, Habab, Beshuk, those villages, there hasn't been anyone in those villages for quite some time. There was a pattern where many of those villages still retained an older form of utilizing the P sound versus the F sound. So pothi rather than fothi. Or prior to the influence, let's say, also of being in diaspora and the sort of the even under Naum Fike, so even in the 20s, 30s, 40s, the resurgence of Syriac, classical Syriac, like Thobonoyo, as being something that was sort of promoted in the community, and the usage of things like raglo instead of an older form, aklo, which was used in villages. How do you, I mean, my question is sort of like, how do you deal with this particular issue? Because there's no question that once, especially in the 2000s, when you have these returnees, there are all sorts of terms coming in. There are neologisms that are developed in, that's cool. That comes in from Europe. These are expressions that come in and sometimes leave impressions on villagers, maybe not one at a particular age, but certain ones. And then they sort of become part of that language. And we certainly noticed that. I've noticed it the many times I've been to Turoyo. It's noticeable even in the usage of Turoyo rather than Surait, right? Just using that term for the language, saying Turoyo rather than Surait. I mean, that Surait was something that was always used. Turoyo comes in much later. But how do you deal with figuring out which one of these things comes in which direction? Because certainly there is that influence. Thank you.
This is an excellent question. The informants with whom we worked, and I share with you too, the women, Shmuni and Nisane. And right now, I and Sergey are currently engaged in working on some of the texts of a gentleman named Numan, are all from people who have, first of all, they're very advanced in age, usually in their 70s or later. And they are all primarily living in their villages. For example, Numan is from Kvarze, the same village as Ilyas. And so to that extent, particularly when you're working with women who tend to be more socially isolated from some of the developments coming in from Europe, that kind of acts as a control on this. Very few of our informants are as young as Ilyas, and he is a remarkably excellent informant. I mean, he speaks Turoyo, so like amazingly well for someone of his young age. He's also highly educated, and like some of the other people that we've been working with. And that's unusual because I have met some of the younger generations, people who have been to Istanbul for their education or been into the diaspora and come back. And you can tell that their language is different, even at the level of the phonology. Another good example of this, and one that I did not mention earlier, but it may actually answer your question to a degree, is that the dialect of the village of Becosione is infamous because it loses its interdental spirant. So there's no th and there's no the, it becomes sa and za. This is very common among this group of languages. And when I was there, I saw, or I heard this with my own ears. I almost said I saw it with my own eyes. The younger people in the village, anyone under 30, spoke like this. But Shmuni, the woman whom I picture there, and Nisane do not talk like this. They retain these interdentals. And that suggests to me that in actual fact, there is a shift here that's going on, and that these women are somewhat isolated from this influence. At least that's my impression. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually wonder about that too, because for as long as I can remember, even speaking with some of the older folks, the joke has always been that if you go to Becosione, Posnoya will say Aizobrijo, right? Mm-hmm. For Merry Christmas or something along Happy mm-hmm. Holidays. So I wonder how far back that goes. And of course, that interdental issue also happens in the diaspora. So many young Assyrians in the diaspora speak that way simply because of the inability to pronounce the th sound. So it's a very interesting situation.
It is. And with regard to the title Turoyo or Surait, now when I first started learning Turoyo with Wolfhard Heinrichs of blessed memory, well, it's almost like 20 years ago. So I instinctually refer to it as Turoyo because I was reared on Otto Jastro's Lehrbuch. But the informants with whom I work almost universally, to a man or woman, refer to it either as Surait or as Turoyo. Now, the younger generation, it seems to me, people of Ilyas's generation will say Turoyo, whereas someone of Nisane's generation will say Sureit. So there does actually seem to be a generational divide there as well. But I haven't actually heard many people from among our informants referring to it as Turoyo, which, and I agree with you, I think this represents the influence of the diaspora and those of us who study these things like I did in the West.
And speaking of your informants, so I just want to kind of tie in a few questions here. Is this do you plan on this project expanding to Kurdish witnesses and their experiences with the Ferman? And then going back to Turoyo as well, or Sureit, you mentioned that there's a sort of attempts to relearn it in areas where it was not the vernacular or the common language. Is that being done strictly on an oral level, or is that also on a written level as well?
Great. Yeah, excellent question. So in terms of the local, of the Kurmanji speaking population in the area, absolutely. My colleagues Gule Demir, and also who's from Kerbaran, and also Sergei Lyosov, are even now working on some publications about the local dialect. And that's linguistically. As I mentioned, this is a linguistic, primarily linguistic research project. It's not necessarily to document the Ferman, although as a consequence of it, some of the texts that we do collect relate to it. And I should say also that as survivors, as people who live in that region for the last, after 1915, the Kurds have their own complicated and very tumultuous relationship with the Turkish government. And so I think to a large degree, that tends to overshadow when we talk about the Ottoman period, because they're dealing with this even now. So I have not, as a matter of course, talked to any of the local people here who speak Kurmanji of the Kurds about the Ferman. It would make it for an interesting topic, to be sure. But naturally, there is a continuing history of violence in the region, which I think needs to be documented more amply. Yeah, okay, and to your second question, I hope that answers the question. For your second question about how Habib Doğan in Ha is re-educating people, my sense is that it is primarily done by, kind of the Sunday school way of having local people who speak the language very well, teach children, almost like an Opan style. I don't think they're using textbooks to teach people Turoyo, but the version of Turoyo that he speaks is actually, it's not Klobanoyo, it's actually Turoyo, it's actually Soyoyo, it's the vernacular dialect. He's not trying to resurrect Syriac. So my sense is that he's actually using local informants, local cultural experts to accomplish this.
Sure. So they're not sort of reducing the Turoyo to a written form to be able to use for instructional purposes. It's really more or less on an oral level.
Yeah, they have the people there to do that, and that's how they're doing it, which is great.
Okay.
Beautiful.
And then there's a question about a nun from Zaz, Warde Gokman, and if you've met her, your experiences with her.
Yeah, I have not been to Zaz. I've been to many of the villages I've shown you, Kfarze, Bekosione. I even went to Haberl, which is a village in the south, and people thought that I was from there because of my last name. So I've visited these places where we've collected the dialect. We have not gone to Zaz precisely because the community there was almost entirely extinguished, as you well know. They're almost completely wiped out. But it is very much a desideratum. I continue to go there. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has put a damper on my research in this area. I did not go this winter, which is normally when we go. I'm hoping that things have changed sufficiently that I can return this summer when we plan to be going back there, in which case, maybe I will go to Zaz and learn more about this situation. I think that's an excellent lead to follow up.
Okay, and we have a question here on the mic from Freddie Michael. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute.
Hello, excellent talk. Do we have, or do you folks have any information or data on the migration of peoples from one faith to the other these days, whether it's Christian to Muslim or vice versa?
In my experience, I'm not really the best person to talk about this. It's very, well, there are two things. Number one, denominational boundaries are very fluid within Christianity here. So I meet people who belong to the Syriac Orthodox Church, and they marry people who are Protestants, like the Belahtik that she mentioned. So that is fluid. Now, if you're living in Tur Abdin, the assumption is that you're going to be Syriac Orthodox. That's not always 100% of the time the case. And generally the children, as I understand, raised in the church of their father. As for conversion from Islam to Christianity and vice versa, my sense is that it's very rare. I hear anecdotally all these stories about people who convert to, usually it's some evangelical denomination of Christianity. I don't know that there is there's been done research systematically to evaluate this phenomenon, however, in the region.
Okay, and then I think
Factor. I'm sorry. That's not a contributive factor to any of these dilutions or wipeouts that we were talking about in modern times, is what I'm gathering from what you just said.
Well, I think that many people during the genocide of 1915 converted to Islam as a way of avoiding being exterminated. But since 1915, I don't think that it's really been a major factor of Christians converting to Islam or vice versa.
Thank you, sir.
yeah. Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think there's actually, I see that Sabri Atman is with us as well, and he asked a question here in the chat, but I know he's written an article on the sort of crypto-Assyrians in Turkey today. So I think just a quick Google search, you'll be able to find that, and it sort of documents sort of descendants of the genocide who, I mean, lived more or less as Muslims and sort of have rediscovered their origins, much like the Armenians as well, the crypto-Armenian community. And then we have a question here in the chat. I mean, you sort of touched upon this earlier, but in your conversations with your informants, have they sort of drawn any direct connections socially, politically, economically, of the atrocities of the past to sort of the current context that they're living in? I mean, do they volunteer that sort of information up?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think, honestly, the events of 1915, the genocide, sort of loom large in the historical memory of the people of the region. But obviously, a lot has gone on since then. It's been now it's been 105 years, 106 years. So a lot has happened in the interval. And, as I mentioned before, she survived Irala, the famine. She survived the insurgency period, the war between the PKK and the Turkish government. So much has happened in the region that it's one out of a very rich history of events that have transpired. So it's not always the kind of the touchstone, the first thing to which my informants have gone to, and when they discuss the contemporary context. I hope that answers the question. I will also say that people speak very freely about this history of persecution there. I mean, we have perceptions, particularly those of us living in the US, of people being horribly oppressed and fearful for their lives in the sense, but I've actually found that my informants in the region have spoken their minds very freely about the political situation, about their fraught history, and many of these aspects.
I mean, I think it's also sort of understandable that any sort of like legitimate political grievances may not be so easily offered up in the context of Turkey, whereas, in diaspora in Europe and in the Americas, people can sort of speak and operate more freely. I mean, obviously the experience of many other peoples throughout time, and especially in my own research for Assyrians in the early 20th century, those living in diaspora were much more easily sort of leveled their sort of grievances against the Qajar government or the Ottoman government than those in the region. So it's sort of understandable. So just a word of encouragement from one of the people here in the chat, just asking you to make sure to document all of the minutia, sort of expand it even. I mean, you mentioned the famine, and you said that you really hadn't spoken about that, but I think, like words of praise for your work, and then also to just sort of, you know, try to document as much as possible. So let me take a look here.
We do have an article coming out. I and my co-authors, Sergei Losov, Nikita Kuzin, and some of the others that I mentioned in the Journal of Semitic Studies, in which Nisane tells her life story. It's huge. It's not going to appear until the next issue, so sometime this coming year. It's a long article, and part of the reason it's long is because we've interlinearized, according to Leipzig notation, morpheme by morpheme, her text. So this story about the Furman is included in there, as well as her experiences during Irala, during the famine. And so it's a very rich, as almost everything she gives us is, a very rich account of her life. And we've made sure to focus upon particularly these aspects, these inflection points of trauma upon her and her community.
Yeah, thank you. And we have a question here in the chat on if there was any DNA data that was being gathered to help trace sort of migration patterns, or maybe if there isn't sort of any DNA data being gathered, which I assume probably not. But sort of, are you also documenting migrational patterns as well in any sense? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, of course, it's of a consuming, I mean, things like being an American, things like DNA and migration are a consuming personal interest of mine. I mean, whenever you talk to a white American, they're always like, you know, I'm 164th Navajo on my grandmother's side or something like that. That's just the way we are. And of course, we all have our own personal stories of migration from the old country. And it was something that came up quite frequently in my discussions with these, particularly these older informants, right? The people who are there are the people who remain behind. And there's been a kind of hollowing out of the countryside ever since the 90s, when the kind of the doors to Europe opened, the floodgates opened, and then suddenly you had all of these Suryani traveling to Belgium, traveling to Sweden, traveling to America in a kind of a push-pull chain, right? Many of them were pushed by the trauma of the region, by, for example, the war that was going on, and many of them were pulled by the promise of better economic opportunities, by the dream of living in these countries, by other members of their families who had already migrated. So it was almost inevitable that some of the best and the brightest and younger generations would leave, whether there was a situation of persecution or not, immediate persecution. So yes, that is something we've been discussing, where people have ended up. We have not, however, approached this in the sort of systematic way that I think we do need, in this case, the careful attentions of a sociologist, right? The type of work that we're doing here, and as I said, we're very narrowly focused as linguists. That's all I'm really competent to do, is study linguistics. The type of work that we're doing here, it's a unique location for us to conduct this type of work. And it so much deserves the attention of serious investigators to document all the aspects, sociological, anthropological, ethnographic. We can talk about the living arts, the material culture. It seriously needs the attention to this. And yet I doubt if very many researchers from institutions in the West, in Europe and the US, are actually sending people there. And I guess it's an issue of our priorities today as scholars and scientists.
Yes, and sort of to kind of just touch upon that again, I mean, you mentioned sort of that this was funded by a Russian institution, correct? And you had a Sergei who was a Russian collaborator. Could you just could you tell us a little bit about him? And then also, speaking of American institutions and sort of finding the funding to support projects such as this, documenting and collective memory of Assyrians, sort of what are sort of the other avenues that scholars and lay people can sort of undertake?
Absolutely. So two things. Number one, what I do is basically all like my own department, right? I was formerly the chair. Now I'm just a civilian again, of the Department of African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian languages and literatures. And the name itself is a kind of Frankenstein's monster, right? Basically what the university has done, and this is increasingly typical of American institutions, is to kind of cobble together the humanities of Black and brown folks, quite frankly, because there's a lot of attention for it, but they want to do it on a shoestring budget. And that is the case. And I don't say this to single out Rutgers. I mean, I have many great things to say about Rutgers. It's a great institution. Don't get me wrong. But that is the case increasingly in the neoliberal American university. So everything that I do is basically cobbled together with duct tape and bubble gum, right? I have a very small research fund, but it's sufficient for me to own a computer, to buy an airline ticket, right? And when I get there, my co-authors, my collaborators, make sure that my needs in terms of a roof over my head and 3 square meals are met. It's not expensive to do this kind of work. Linguists and humanists in general, we're cheap dates, right? You can do this type of research without $1 million budget. All you need to do is to have a computer to access the world, a personal computer. Now you can do most of this even on your phone or your tablet, and to be able to go to libraries, or even better in my case, to speak to living people, which is, in my opinion, even better than going to a book in a library. Not everyone can afford to travel to Turkey, it's true. The American dollar is doing very well against the Turkish lira at the moment, so it makes it more affordable than it would have been in the past. But I think those of you who are embedded in Assyrian communities have a unique privilege that someone like myself does not have, which is that you are surrounded by this living history. And there's much that you can do, again, with duct tape and bubble gum to record them. Even something as simple as creating YouTube videos like the one I just shared with you, which I created. Right? That's 6 minutes. It took me not that long to transcribe everything in the orthography we're using for Turoyo, for Turoyo, and to add English subtitles and throw that on YouTube. I mean, if everyone in the Assyrian community who had those types of competencies, and it doesn't take much, were to do this, then I think the prospects for documenting this information and of preserving the language would actually be quite rosy.
Thank you. And we have a couple of questions here. I'm going to go back to Belmina.
Hi, I don't mean to take all your time, but I was listening to you when you said about wanting to do research in Aramaic and that it would cost a lot. And I was wondering, first of all, if you can give me a ballpark figure as far as what the cost of something like that is, and even if it's shared between institutions. Also, interestingly, I came across, and a lot of us have Assyrians, across a gentleman who is Jewish who had left Iraq, northern Iraq in 1951. His name is Yaakov Mose. And interestingly, him and 150 other Jewish people who spoke Assyrian thought that they were speaking Kurdish all this time. And when they went to Israel right now, slowly, I mean, it's like they're coming on to the next generation, and slowly the new generation is losing the Assyrian language. And now they're finding out that they were speaking Assyrian all this time, and they want to go back and learn the language. And actually, they're recognizing that their Torah is written in Aramaic as well. So I'm kind of wondering if knowing something like that, and knowing that they're interested also in Aramaic and the New Age Assyrian that we're speaking at this time, might be helpful for you in terms of starting something, with them. And the other thing is, I was listening to the lady that when she was speaking. I'm sorry, I forgot her name. Usually, when I hear people, Assyrian people, I understand them. Chaldeans, I understand they've got Assyrian and lots of Arabic. I understand what they're saying. With her, I understood some words, but there was a lot that was in there, and I'm wondering, what was it mixed in with? I mean, or was it just what she was talking, something that they created? Was it not mixed in maybe with some Kurdish, some Turkish, some other things, some other languages that was like what created that Syriac, that Turoyo, that she was speaking? If you can answer those questions, and I thank you in advance.
All right. I think your first question, thank you very much for your questions. I think your first question was how much it would take to do this sort of work. Really, it depends on you. So like to make a YouTube video, I need a webcam or my phone. I've done that too. And I have a good microphone as well. I'm using it at the moment. It's maybe not the best in the world, but again, it depends on your budget. And you need a computer to edit these things on, maybe some software, but there is freely available shareware software that you can use. So this can be remarkably low budget, but there is, in my opinion, for the types of concerns we have here, which is about documenting intangible culture, right? The stories of your people, their histories. There is not a huge difference between like a AAA Hollywood production and a video that's taken with a webcam. In my opinion, I think they're equally valuable. And to a certain extent, these kind of home videos have a certain authenticity to them that really glossy productions lack. And that's why I think if people would just flood some of these Facebook or YouTube, for example, with homemade videos of these stories, it would be really, I think, a watershed in the documentation and the preservation of these cultures. I had tried to do a similar project. Again, I sought funding. It didn't materialize. When I was living in Yemen, on one of the dialects of modern South Arabian that's spoken there, people would record their weddings and people performing traditional poetry in their language with their cell phones. And I, with my collaborator, Sam Liebhaber, attempted to get funding from the National Sciences Foundation to digitize and record and create a repository of these wedding videos as a way to kind of preserve this language. But unfortunately, it never materialized. And, you know, of course, the situation in Yemen is more prohibitive for studying these languages now than any other place in the world, as far as I'm concerned. So there's that. You also asked about people of different faiths who speak this language. And I would say the interesting thing for my money about Assyrian or Turoyo or however you want to call it is that so many people of different denominations and faiths speak it, right? There are Jews who speak this language. There are Christians. There are even Muslims, right? There are two Muslim villages in Syria in which this language is spoken. And so you can find people from all of these different, you can find people of all these different backgrounds who speak it, and they each have their own histories and things to contribute towards our understanding and appreciation of this language and its culture. The third question, I'm trying to remember. I wish I had written it down. Do you remember it, Joseph?
Yes, I think it was sort of, if I understood it correctly, more or less like the influences. So the person who asked the question mentioned not being able to understand all of the words. So what sort of what sort of loan words, what sort of reference, linguistically outside of Assyrian are people, what sort of words are they using from what languages? Right.
So no one speaks language in a vacuum. And in this case, she is a member of a community living in a situation of a multilinguistic situation for hundreds or even thousands of years. And her language reflects that. So for example, there are some Arabic words in her language, which is unusual because there aren't actually any Arabs in or around the vicinity of Daqobe. And as Otto Yastro has demonstrated, most of the Arabic vocabulary in Turoyo is extremely old. It dates back to a period way before the present date. There's almost no Turkish because, as I mentioned before, Nisane is not formally educated. She doesn't know Turkish. She speaks Turoyo and Kurmanji, both fluently. They're her two languages. She's bilingual in them. And there is some Kurmanji influence, but, you know, to the extent to which I've examined this language, I don't see it as being, you know, it's less than you would think it is, right? Especially given that she herself is a fluent speaker of both languages. You might expect there to be more influence for that reason. You might expect her to be switching between the two at times, as people often do in multilingual situations. But in actual fact, she seems to keep them separated quite well. When she's speaking Kurmanji, she speaks Kurmanji. When she speaks Turoyo, it's that. And the words that she uses that are Kurmanji are those that are also found and are used by other speakers, including those who may not be fluent in this language. Although, of course, there are very few of them because most of the people in this region, if they speak another language, it's going to be Kurmanji. They may also know Turkish as well, particularly if they're the younger generation who has been educated in the Turkish school system.
Yes, I mean, someone also is referencing sort of the spoken language of members in Iraq and Iran. I think that sort of answers the question. I mean, it's obviously languages aren't spoken in a vacuum, and they're sort of influenced by other regional languages that dominate. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I think, you know, the way that linguists describe Turoyo or Turoyo is interesting. It's maybe not the way that native speakers would intuit. I'll give you an example. So my previous research, with which I'm still continuing, is on Mandaic. And that is spoken all the way at the head of the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, in the south. And when I was living in Tur Abdin, when I was in Midyat, we also had one of our informants is a young man. He's a Turkish instructor, although he himself is Turoyo. And he's from Mzizah, so he's helping us document that dialect. And he wanted to hear some of my previous research, the things that I had documented. And when I played it for him, he automatically recognized it as being his language. He didn't have to think twice about it. Now, when you look at the way that we define these languages, Turoyo, and you can even look at a map of the Middle East, Turoyo, Suryoyo, all the way up here, up in the north, right? The very northernmost extent of this language. And Mandaic, way down in the south and the east. So the fact that he was able to recognize, and I understand that this is not necessarily always the case with the various forms of Assyrian that are spoken. Sometimes when you hear one of the dialects being spoken, you really don't even know if it is in fact Assyrian. But for these two dialects that are so far distant from one another, he immediately recognized it as something, as his own language. And he could pick out words. I was frankly astonished myself.
Wonderful. You know, I think we can sort of begin to wrap up. I don't think we have any other questions in the chat. I want to thank you again, Professor Haberl, for a wonderful lecture. And, you know, I'm duty bound to mention really the generous benefactors that we have who made this lecture series possible. And I want to mention that the series is made possible through a generous donation from the Assyrian Universal Alliance Foundation, the AUAF, Dr. John Michael, Dr. Ronald Michael, Dr. Edison Ishaya, Dr. Mark Markardishian, Mr. Robert De Caleda, and Mr. Ebi Paul Judu. You know, we really want to thank them for their financial support in making all of this happen. And really, thank you again for a very engaging discussion and great presentation.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure, and I'm really glad. I had a great time, and I think the questions were incredibly, they're just exact. They're perfect, actually.
Wonderful. I mean, with that, I think we could sort of end the lecture for today. I'm sure people can find you if they want to reach out via email and connect with you and discuss some of these topics in more detail. You are at Rutgers University. A quick Google search, I'm sure, will be able to get all the contact information they need. So thank you again, and we wish everyone a wonderful evening, and we'll be back soon with part 3 of the lecture series. So
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
thank you.